I'm going to talk a little bit today about specifically those things that if you're a developer for enterprise, and many of you may be developing consumer apps. Some of what I'm talking about is useful for that as well, but I especially want to talk about enterprise because this is an area where there's a tremendous amount of growth. There's a lot of new features, and particularly in Android, there's a lot that we've done recently in the last few releases of Android that you may not even be aware of that you can take advantage of in the enterprise apps that you develop. There we go. Yep, let's see. There we go. So the first thing, and you probably are aware that if you're a developer on Android, that Android is everywhere, and that we're well past the billion device mark in terms of active devices. We're 1.5 billion at this point. Each day, there's another 1.5 million devices that are activated, and there are more than 24,000 different models of devices that run Android. Of course, it's a well-known challenge that's out there. There's 1,300 device brands right now. The breadth and variety of Android devices is absolutely amazing, and the fact that they're all running the same operating system. There has been no other operating system in history that has this amount of variety of devices, this amount of variety of manufacturers. Certainly, we saw a lot of manufacturers in the PC era, but nothing like we're seeing in mobile. Couple that with the largest distribution platform in the world in Play. And there's obviously for a long time we've had well over 1 million applications available on Play. We're having 65 billion downloads per day with the Play platform, and over 1 billion active users of that. Right? Not every Android device uses Play for distribution, but certainly the vast majority do. When you look at the portfolio of solutions, particularly from Google overall, that run on this whole range of devices, from the smartphone I've had this now for 2 years. I'm completely used to it. I stopped wearing a watch maybe 15 years ago, and ever since I've had this, it's completely changed the way that I work with my mobile phone. It stays in my pocket more. I use this to get notifications. I keep track of multiple time zones with it, and as I travel, it automatically changes time for me. That's super convenient, right? That's the smallest form factor here. And then we have this very large digital signage. Some Android there, but a lot of Chrome OS in those markets, right? We've got Chrome OS on desktop form factors. Many of you may not be aware that last year we actually sold more Chromebooks than Apple sold MacBooks, right? So we're now the number 2 laptop form factor in terms of sales, right? Immense variety of devices that are out there. What's happening in enterprise, though, is particularly interesting. For many years, it's fair to say that Google was largely ignoring the enterprise market. We did very minimal things in Android to provide features for enterprise management. It's only recently that we've begun putting those kinds of management features in Android, and that started with Lollipop. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is really the complete life cycle of especially if you're a builder of enterprise applications. What do you need to be thinking about during the design phase? What do you need to be thinking about as you're building those applications? And what are those features, especially if you're working with enterprise customers, that you want to be thinking about and utilizing as you deploy Android in the enterprise, which is something that certainly in this market, it's very common, right? In other parts of the world, Android is still playing catch up in the enterprise space. one of the things that enterprises have taken a little bit more time than consumers is taking advantage of all the sensors that are on the device. Even though this is one of the most important aspects of mobilizing enterprise applications, being able to take advantage of all that additional data that these sensors provide, all the additional possibilities, all those things that you can shortcut for the user. And there are so many possibilities here, and yet very few enterprise applications today are taking advantage of that. I want to just give a few examples. This is actually more of a B2C app, but it's a great example of how simple things and using the sensors can improve the overall user experience. This is an app by British Gas, and it's a very simple app for consumers to enter their gas reading. And you can see a little bit more about this, in fact, throughout the presentation. There will be code snippets and other reference material. You can grab the QR code off of the slide and see a lot more. So this is a very simple application, and in fact, I don't believe this one uses the camera, but it wouldn't take that much more work to take advantage of the camera. But very simple user experience, and it changes the way that this company does business with its customers in a very big way, and it's a very easy, simple UX. The area of augmented reality, we're just getting started. I think this is one of the coolest. You can basically take your smartphone, because of the GPS that's out there, you can go out in the real world and couple that with information that's on the transponders that exists on most commercial vessels. You can be in a port and just point your device at a vessel and see exactly the information that that transponder is sending out there. You can of course go to a website, right? But when you're interacting with the real world this way, the possibilities are so much more powerful, right? And when you think about all the steps you have to go through to navigate through a website to get this same information versus just pulling out your phone and pointing it in the direction of the vessel that you see and immediately getting that information, right? It's phenomenal in terms of the simplification of the user experience, the power of that, and yet it's, you're doing not a crazy amount of work as a developer to take advantage of that. Here's an internal app that we have that we use inside Google. We call it FixIt. It opens and allows you to review and modify tickets that you may have open for various things. But the first thing it does is it uses the GPS and determines your location and gives you some suggestions as to where you might be reporting the issues based on not only the GPS information that it has, but also in our case, we have all of our facilities mapped out, and we have a special version of Google Maps just for us. And the combination of that makes it really easy. If you're in, say, a specific conference room, you need to report a problem in that conference room, you've already got half of the information at your fingertips to be able to fill it out and open the ticket. So it reduces the friction in getting that ticket open. It reduces the friction in seeing the status of the ticket. And it's just simple use of these sensors that are already on the device. Now, as you're going to build your application, there's several new things in Android that you want to be aware of, especially if you're doing enterprise app, right? The first thing that I want to mention, just because it gets easily overlooked. There was a time when the compute power of a mobile device was insufficient to run secure protocols without slowing down the user experience, right? That time is long past. There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be, especially if you've got a back-end SaaS service, using HTTPS just by default, right? The devices are capable, the servers are capable, the compute power is not outside the range of the affordable at all, right? This is now, in fact, in the world we live in where there are so many different potential eavesdroppers on the conversations that are happening, and so many ways to exploit that data, use those secure protocols. Use the local storage on the device to cache what you can. I often see the very first iteration of a native app just essentially be a web view into the web experience, but nobody's caching information, nobody's allowing for that app to be useful when there's not network connectivity at a given moment. What's the point of having a native app if you're not taking advantage of those features? And then the last one, and I'll go into this a little bit more, Safety Net on Android provides some very powerful ways of letting you as an individual app developer know that you're dealing with a device that's not rooted, that's not compromised in any way. And there may be a lot of reasons. In fact, the biggest user of our Safety Net attestation APIs is not enterprise at all. And we'll get to that in a moment. So one of the things that when we talk about, let's see, when we talk specifically about how the app uses storage, one of the most important things you can do is not interact with the device as you would a PC. Not think about the directories that are on the device. Not use that mode of accessing files or saving files. And the main reason for that is if you do everything through intents, you're going to, especially in a world where we have multiple profiles possible on a device, and I'll talk briefly about this, but starting in Lollipop, we made it possible for work profiles to be added to a device. That means that you may have more than one user running simultaneously on a device. That work user, can be completely separately managed by the enterprise. You can have the same app, say your Chrome browser, in both has completely separate application data. Its storage of bookmarks and cookies and all of that completely separate. Intents are resolved separately. There are the possibilities of having what we call cross-profile intents that allow, say, information that's on the personal side to be shared over to the work side. The other way is only possible when the enterprise allows it by policy. But the point is that you need to be prepared in your app for these kinds of things that aren't going to come through the file system paths that you might normally be expected to see. On top of that, it's more secure that way. And apps, naturally, the way that the security model is set up on Android is that one app cannot interact with another app's data when it's placed there in default storage locations, because of the permissions setup that exists in Android to begin with. And so when you're putting application data outside in the file system, you're also exposing it to any other app that might exist on that device. One of the most important things you can do when you're designing your app is just get out of that file system mentality, get out of that mentality of kind of PC OS type design, because in a cloud mobile world, you don't want people thinking in terms of directory structures. You don't want your users having to worry about that sort of thing. And B, there are other things going on. Now, I want to talk a little bit about attestation because this is something it's relatively new but extremely powerful. Any application can ask for attestation. It's part of Google Play services. What's cool about it is we see every version of the Android OS that gets approved on a certified Google device. Any device that's able to ship with the Google applications and be licensed there. It's also gone through a certification process. We've seen the entire system image, and we can take advantage of our knowledge of that to be able to tell you whether that particular device has been modified or not. And the great thing about it is if you ask the device, hey, are you compromised or not? A compromised device is always going to say, hey, nothing to see here, don't worry about me. But when you're using the actual attributes of the device to validate that it has been unmodified, it is much more difficult. And in fact, there's been a bit of a cat and mouse game. I think we've reached the point where most of those trying to defeat it have given up because it's proven to be so difficult. You can make, as any application, a request to validate this through SafetyNet and know with very good assurance that that device hasn't been modified. Who's the biggest user of this? It's not an enterprise. It's not a bank. It's Pokemon Go. Why is that important to them? Well, it completely ruins the gameplay if anyone can go in and muck around with their location settings and just go around and pick up Pokemon. That entire game experience would have been ruined if they couldn't block out rooted devices, right? Many of you have apps, even if you're consumer apps, that have similar dynamics where if you're dealing with rooted devices, you can't assure that you're getting, even simple things like, let's say you've got the Uber app, right? You don't want drivers to be able to say that they're in a different location than they actually are at, and it's going to ruin the customer experience, right? There are many, many apps for which knowing that the device is not compromised is important. And the best thing about this is free. You don't have to pay a third party for this service. It's just there. I want to talk a little bit about single sign-on because this is an area where everybody understands what single sign-on is supposed to be, but very few people are actually implementing it in their apps, and even more rare is that they're doing it securely. The whole point of single sign-on is that you sign on to one application once, say with your corporate credentials, and then subsequent applications, you don't have to sign on again. But in practice, especially on mobile devices, that hasn't been the case, right? If you took a typical application that supported single sign-on, say a year ago, and you signed on to one app, you probably have a web view pop up, and you'd sign in, using some type of an OAuth integration. But then you go to the next app, and you got to sign on again because WebView doesn't actually save any of the information in cookies that the identity provider would need to know that, oh, I'm dealing with the same environment. It also makes it really easy for the app developer to just directly grab those things that the identity provider should have, and it actually breaks the security model of WebSSO in a really bad way. The proper way to do this is to actually follow the web pattern, and the way to do this properly is with a pattern. We actually have a library that supports this. We put this out together with the OpenID Foundation. It's the exact same pattern as you see on the web, but it uses custom tabs, whether it's Chrome custom tabs or another browser. That doesn't matter. But if you've ever done WebSSO, this is the exact same pattern. The difference is because you're using a custom tab, you've got the cookie persistence, you actually have the security properties you want. It exactly follows the pattern that you're used to in the web world, but with your native applications, and you're not giving up your user experience in the process. And what we've done is we've created a library, and it's actually not only on Android, but also for iOS. We have this same challenge on iOS, and there's no reason, people may be surprised, but we're the largest developer of applications on iOS. And we have to solve this problem there as well as a company. So with the OpenID Foundation, we've taken advantage of the properties of the custom tabs. And what you're seeing here is the Chrome custom tab. What's great about it is that this is something that's you don't have to wait for the newest version of Android. It actually goes back all the way to Jelly Bean. And if the particular device is older, it even works just with popping out to the system browser. It's not that much of a UX compromise. The great thing about this is that the user can then see exactly where the identity provider is. They can't modify that. You get the shared cookie state, so you actually get single sign-on. And the user experience is it looks like it's still happening within the app. In iOS, it's using SF Safari View Controller. Android, it is custom tabs, Chrome custom tabs by default on most devices. So with the OpenID Foundation, we released this library called appoff, and it gives you that single sign-on. There's a lot more information. If you go to github.com/OpenID, you'll see there's an appoff library for Android, there's an appoff library for iOS. This library you can implement directly if you like. It's really easy. It does all the heavy lifting for you. Or you can just grab the code and use it as sample code. Either way, it's going to greatly improve your single sign-on experience. And whether you're using social type logins like Google or Facebook, or you're using corporate single sign-on, it supports OAuth, it supports OpenID Connect, and on top of that, now you may be asking, well, what about SAML? Well, SAML's not actually defined outside of a web browser. In some respects, yes, it supports SAML, but you should think of the SAML as the back-end protocol. What's actually happening locally is OAuth. I want to make a brief mention here. Many of you may be familiar that last year, we made it possible to run Android apps on Chrome OS. Now, if you're an Android developer, hopefully you've been following best practices so your app works really great on tablets, but this is yet another reason for you to be considering how does your app look and behave on a device that always has a keyboard, always has a pointing device, always has a larger display. Right. The best thing about this is mostly it just works. Now, if your app requires certain sensors that you just assume are going to be there on every Android device, you might want to reconsider whether those should actually be optional in your app so that those can run on Chromebooks that may not have every sensor that a mobile phone may have. But apart from that, it just works. Several things I want to highlight specifically here. Make sure that your app runs well on a large screen, right? Optimize for that. Consider how this is going to work in a multi-window mode. Think about your keyboard shortcuts, right? You may not be thinking about that at all for an Android app, but on a Chromebook where you've got a keyboard, it's excellent to be able to use those keyboard shortcuts. It's not a lot of work as a developer to add those. And support for a stylus, which may not be common on most Android phones, but is available on the newer Chromebooks. Stylus and inking that's something you may want to consider adding as functionality to your app. So in particular, when you're talking about large screens and you're thinking about these may be individual activities that you've got to slide in and out on a small device, or they're separate screens. You may want to have those activities presented simultaneously on a large device. Right? A lot more guidance and information here if you want to scan the QR code. Think about the menus that you pull out from the side, have those there available for the user, and think about how this is going to work in a multi-window environment. Right? The last thing I want to talk about, and this is really the most central to the changes that we've made in Android recently, is how to work with managed Android. Now, many of you may be familiar with device admin. That's something that had kind of a limited amount of supervision and possibilities, and we've actually been removing features from that in some of the more recent releases. There's some security reasons for that, and happy to talk to anyone afterwards that has questions. But we now have these two new modes where you've got a fully managed device, and you're actually setting that up from the setup wizard on. And you've got this work profile that I described. You can see these badged applications. Those are actually running in a secondary user that's logged in at the same time. And it lets you completely separate your work applications and data from your personal apps. The enterprise manages those work apps, but you've got freedom and privacy for your personal use of that device. These are two things that you want to be aware of as an application developer, because you may have two instances of your app running simultaneously. For instance, you can see that right here we've got the version of, oh, that doesn't seem to work. Okay, you've got the version of Chrome that's the personal version, and then you've got a badged version that's your work version here. So I talked briefly about this. Use content URIs, don't use file URIs. That'll make sure that things work properly when you're dealing with multiple profiles. There's an enormous amount of possibility with something called managed configuration. You can take anything that is a potentially configurable attribute of your app and make it possible for an enterprise mobility management solution to pre-configure that on the device. And we can do everything from strings to all the way to bundles and bundle arrays. So the possibilities are pretty much endless as far as what you could configure for your app without the user having to be involved. And we've got a complete solution for that in Android. So more of that is on App Config Community, and I think this is pretty much it. So.
Okay, great, Andy. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I'm sure that you are ready to chat with guys who have some questions now in the hall. So thank you.